Witchwater by Phyllis Reynolds Naylor, Chapter 1. At first, Lynn was sure the old woman waited for her. Old Mrs. Tuggle, who kept herself in the house on the hill. Lynn need only pause for a moment, remembering, and the thin, bony face appeared before her, one eye green, one eye gray, with a mouth that opened a crack when she smiled, displaying a gold tooth. It was the way she looked at Lynn, a sly, calculating kind of squint, as though watching for the proper time to make a move, the right time to draw Lynn under her spell. There were ties that drew Lynn to Mrs. Tuggle, whether she trusted her or not. Mother, for instance, was a writer who rented a remodeled henhouse from the old woman to use as a studio. Judith, Lynn's sister, had spent most of her evenings last summer sewing with Mrs. Tuggle in an upstairs room of the ancient house. Stevie, Lynn's small brother, liked the stories Mrs. Tuggle told of bogles and hoobiahs, and often wandered up to visit without telling anyone where he was going. And there was a deep pull inside Lynn herself that she couldn't explain. Perhaps it was this that frightened her most. Autumn was creeping slowly in, bringing a chill in the mornings. Stevie was off to kindergarten. Judith was interested in other things, and now Mrs. Tuggle's small, sharp eyes seemed focused not only on Lynn, but on her friend Marjorie Beasley, better known as Mouse, as well. No one, however, took Lynn's fears seriously. No one but Marjorie. Lynn's father grew impatient with talk of witchcraft, which he labeled imaginative nonsense. Lynn sat at the table, idly balancing her knife on the edge of her plate, wondering if she dared bring up the subject again. Proof. If she only had evidence that the old woman was trying to lure them into her coven, a buried rock maybe, with words, Eleonora Tuggle was admitted this day to the circle of sorcery, engraved in Greek letters, and signed below with a big splotch of raven's blood, something like that. Instead of proof, there was just this awful feeling, this sense of evil, an awesome awareness of being near the unknown. Surprisingly, however, it was Father who brought the subject up. Amazing what ideas people get when they don't have enough to keep them busy, he said, spreading a blob of butter over his mashed potatoes. A clerk at the courthouse was checking the graves in the old cemetery with county death certificates, and it seems he can't find a certificate for somebody named C.L. Pritchard. One of the secretaries says it's the grave of Mrs. Tuggle's young brother, drowned over 40 years ago when he was 16. Now there's gossip going around about how the boy really died. Anything to start a little excitement. The knife slid on Lynn's plate, clunked off the edge and onto the table. She didn't move, her eyes fixed on her father. Mrs. Morley looked at Lynn and then at her husband. Now, Dick, you're going to get Lynn started again. The last thing we need around here is more gossip about Mrs. Tuggle. Lynn pressed her lips together firmly, her jaw clenched. Maybe she had good reason to be worried. That's exactly why I brought it up, Mr. Morley said. I want the girls to see how easily gossip can get started and how quickly it gets out of hand. Somebody misfiled the death certificate, obviously, but now there's talk that perhaps this death wasn't accidental. Perhaps it was murder, and the missing death certificate would prove it. A lot of nonsense, that's what it is. Don't look at me, Judith said from her side of the table. I'm not the least bit concerned about Mrs. Tuggle. Wait till Lynn starts junior high. She'll have so much to think about she'll forget all about her witch hobby. It's not a hobby, Lynn snapped angrily. She hadn't said a word, and suddenly they were all jumping on her. I'll keep my thoughts to myself, thank you, and you can just stop trying to pry inside my mind. Hey, Dad said playfully, don't get mad. I'm sorry I brought the subject up. It's just that I knew you'd hear the gossip sooner or later, and I wanted you to know how it started. Stevie sat eating his peas one at a time with his fingers. His eyes, wide-spaced, resembled Mother's. So did Judith's. It was Lynn, who looked like her father, pale, gray speckled eyes, in a pale, freckled face. A long sort of face that looked as though it had been stretched a little. There were times when she resented looking like her father, and this was one of them. I didn't know Lynn's hobby was witches, Stevie said. Sure, I collect them and keep them in a bottle. Lynn pushed her plate away and got up. Father reached over and grabbed her arm, pulling her to him. Come on, girl, I didn't mean to ruin dinner, he said fondly. If I mention Mrs. Tuggle again, may my mouth turn to mush. Buddies? Buddies, Lynn said, not quite convincingly. She went to the small room off the hallway, the music room they called it because it held the piano. There was also a bay window on one side, and here Lynn curled up on the cushioned seat, her favorite thinking place. Her thoughts spun wildly. She shook her head to clear it of imaginative nonsense. She would go about this scientifically, methodically. She would take each piece of information she had about Mrs. Tuggle and fit it carefully into the puzzle, and she would not make any accusations till the puzzle was complete. It did not help, of course, that Mother herself was working on a novel about witches. Why had she turned from adventure stories of horses and the high seas to writing about bodily possession, spooking the atmosphere even more? There were times, Lynn felt, that her mother believed in the strangeness of Mrs. Tuggle also, times when a flicker of fear reflected in Mrs. Morley's eyes, as Lynn told her something about the old woman that she hadn't noticed herself. But the conversation would always end with the warning that it was easy to accuse someone falsely, that just because Mrs. Tuggle was a little eccentric did not mean she was a witch, and that Lynn need only remember the Salem witch trials to see what careless accusations had done to many innocent women. Lynn! Mother was standing in the doorway, her light brown hair drawn back with a blue scarf. She was holding a cellophane-wrapped platter of blueberry muffins. The best way to deal with suspicions about somebody is to get to know them better, she said. Just for me, won't you try to be more friendly with Mrs. Tuggle? Sometimes, people sense when others distrust them, and it just builds the wall between them even higher. How about taking her this plate of fresh muffins? It was exactly what Lynn wanted, the opportunity to observe Mrs. Tuggle up close, to learn everything she could. All right, she said, getting up, but I'm going to call Mouse to go with me. Fine, Mrs. Tuggle will appreciate it. She gets so lonely. Mother started back to the kitchen, then stopped, and her eyes were laughing. If you're not back by 10, I'll call the sheriff. Marjorie Beasley lived 2 blocks away. Every home in this section of town was Victorian, with high ceilings and gingerbread ornamentation all around. But the Beasley house was rather coming apart, as Mother put it, for the paint was peeling, the roof needed shingles, and the porch swing had come down months ago and had not been put back up again. Mouse, in fact, always looked as though she were coming apart, or perhaps that she had come apart and someone had thrown her back together again. Her socks often did not match her shoelaces, were too short, or her wrinkled t-shirt had obviously been selected at random and pulled down over any pair of jeans that was handy. More often than not, she simply pulled on a big poncho that came down below her bony knees, and Lynn suspected that she wore nothing underneath but pants. It certainly made dressing easier. To complete her costume, Marjorie wore a huge owl-like pair of glasses, and Judith had once remarked that if Mouse ever flapped her arms, she'd fly. Perhaps Mouse and the Beasley home looked as they did because the family itself was coming apart. Marjorie's 2 older brothers had married and moved away, and only a few weeks ago her parents had decided to separate. Marjorie's mother had gone to Ohio to live with relatives, and Mouse had stayed behind with her father in the big house on the hill. Mr. Beasley owned a store that specialized in rare books. When he came home in the evenings, he helped cook dinner, but the housekeeping was Marjorie's responsibility. If she should be taking blueberry muffins to anyone, Lynn decided, it was the Beasleys. So when Mouse answered the door, in a huge orange t-shirt that came almost to her knees, Lynn said, Mom sent half these muffins for you, and I'm supposed to take the rest to Mrs. Tuggle. Want to come with me? Mouse opened the screen door wide and followed Lynn back to the kitchen. I don't understand your mother, she said simply. I really don't. Why is she always trying to get you to go see Mrs. Tuggle? Doesn't she even care what happens? Lynn put half the muffins on a plate, then added 1 extra and wrapped the others up again. She says that the best way to overcome my suspicions is to get to know her better. I'd rather go on being suspicious, Mouse said. When I'm near her, Lynn, I feel, weak, like I'm turning into butter. It's as if something's in the air that I can't see. Then you feel it too. Lynn perched on a kitchen stool, her tan ponytail hanging down her back, and looked intently at her friend. I wish it was something we could touch, something we could show to somebody. Dad says it's all imaginative nonsense. He wouldn't say that if you went to Mrs. Tuggle's some night and never came back. Marjorie picked up a muffin and stuffed part of it in her mouth, catching the crumbs with her other hand. Lynn smiled faintly. Mother says if we're not back by 10, she'll call the sheriff. Come on, Mouse. I'll feel better if you're along. Besides, I've got new information I'll tell you on the way up. It was unfair, Lynn knew, because there were only two things that could lure Mouse into doing what she didn't want to do: food and secrets, and Lynn had used both for bait. They walked back through the hall, past the book-lined study where Marjorie's father was sorting a box of old magazines. Going out for a while with Lynn, Mouse called, pausing a moment in the doorway. Mr. Beasley turned and looked at them, over glasses that were only half as big as Marjorie's, little half circles that rested just below his eyes. Hi, Lynn, he said. A big mustache seemed to cover his entire mouth and made Lynn wonder idly whether that was what made Mrs. Beasley leave him. It matched the shaggy sideburns on either side of his face, as well as his heavy brows. Been reading about your father in the paper, about the zoning commission that's studying the old cemetery. It said that some folks want to dig it up and build a high-rise apartment. Lynn nodded. Father was a lawyer for the county, and she didn't pay much attention to what he did. Much of what he talked about at the dinner table didn't particularly interest her, but she knew about the cemetery, and of course, there was that bit about the death certificate. He was saying something about the cemetery just today, Lynn answered. Mr. Beasley carefully studied the date on one of the magazines, then laid it in a pile with the others. Well, I, for one, hope they give up the idea. Every time anything gets to be 100 years old, seems there's always somebody who wants to tear it down or dig it up or cover it over with cement. This is a fine old Indiana town, and I don't see why we have to look like a spring chicken when we're not. Next, it'll be all the old houses, he grunted disgustedly. And then I suppose we'll do away with people who reach 100. Lynn didn't quite know how to answer. Mother sent over some blueberry muffins, she said hesitantly. Mr. Beasley smiled without looking up. I'll have one later. Tell her we appreciate it, Lynn. And if you want to tell your dad how I feel about digging up old cemeteries, I won't mind a bit. Lynn and Marjorie went out on the porch and started up the brick sidewalk to the house at the top of the hill. Lynn tried to imagine all the homes on the street being replaced by split levels and a high-rise apartment building where the old cemetery was now. That would be absolutely awful, she agreed. The sky had turned a dusky gray like smoke, settling lower and lower over the treetops. The street lights came on, and lamps burned in windows along the way. The air had a crispness about it that reminded Lynn of apples and dry leaves. For 3 weeks, she and Mouse had been walking up this same hill with books under their arms. But they always made a left turn before they got to the top and walked 4 blocks to Dover School. 6th grade at last. It used to be all they ever thought about. Now they thought about Mrs. Tuggle and just what it was she wanted of them. Okay, Mouse said finally. What's the information? Lynn remembered. Tonight, at the dinner table, she began slowly, wanting to make it last. Dad said that a clerk in the courthouse was checking all the graves in the cemetery with county death certificates, and there was only one missing. C.L. Pritchard. Mouse wasn't particularly impressed. What's so interesting about that? I mean, if they had the certificate, but the grave was missing, now that would be something. Anyway, what's a death certificate and who's C.L. Pritchard? Well, when somebody dies, a doctor has to sign a paper saying that he examined the body and that it was really dead, and he has to write down why the person died just to make it official. But they can't find the one for C.L. Pritchard, who just happens to be Mrs. Tuggle's brother. Mouse stopped and looked at Lynn. She told us he drowned when he was 16. That's what she said, and that's what everybody believes. But what if a doctor never saw the body? What if he died of something else? What if he was murdered instead? Mouse sat down on a low wall along the sidewalk. That does it, she declared flatly. I'm not going up there. Look, Lynn, I've got all sorts of things to do. I promised Dad I'd wash my hair, and I've got to write Mother, and the dishes aren't done. Lynn sat down beside her. I'm sorry I said that. Dad says it's all stupid gossip. You mean other people are thinking the same thing? Just some of the secretaries at the courthouse. Dad says that's the way stories get started, reputations get ruined. Mouse shook her head. No deal. No way. Look, Lynn, I'll go as far as her porch, but then I'm going to wait on the steps till you come out, okay? Sure, Lynn said, knowing that curiosity would get the better of Mouse and drive her inside. It always did. Marjorie was absolutely terrified and enthralled by suspense. She reached for it and backed away at the same time. She panicked whenever they met Mrs. Tuggle, but would have been furious if Lynn ever went to visit without her. Maybe she just liked to be scared, and maybe that's all there was to it for her. And possibly Lynn as well. Imaginative nonsense. She frowned. No, there was more involved than that. There was real fear, and she couldn't seem to make Father believe that. They passed a clump of spruce trees on a corner lot, and instantly Mrs. Tuggle's house came into view, dark against the night sky. A trace of purple remained on the gathering clouds overhead, and the chimney of the old house seemed to reach out from the roof and touch it, like the spire of a church. Tall trees stood like spies in the front yard, their leafy ears turned in all directions, and a thorn apple blocked the front door completely from view. In the vast yard behind, which sloped directly down to the creek, were an old barn, a tractor shed, and the remodeled hen house where Mrs. Morley wrote. An upper porch extended around three sides of the house like a balcony, with a staircase leading down. The windows were completely dark. There was no light on at all. She's not home, Mouse said, relieved. Let's go back. Lynn paused. There was no sound but the wind in the trees. Perhaps the old woman had gone shopping. Perhaps she had gone to bed early and would not want to be disturbed. But suddenly the door opened slowly, and they could see the figure of a small woman beckoning to them. Light came on behind Mrs. Tuggle, and she opened the screen. She stood there, peering out into the darkness. Come in, girls. It's the Arsnippy, it is. I was about to have my evening tea, and there's water enough for all of us. How did she know we were out here? Mouse whispered. I don't know. Maybe she was watching from the window. Lynn started up the steps, and as she knew what happened, Mouse followed obediently. We didn't think you were home, Lynn said to Mrs. Tuggle. The house was dark. I'm not much for lights, till it's really black, you know. Mrs. Tuggle led the way inside. When you've lived in a house as long as I have, you know where everything is. Don't need a light to tell me where the teapot is, or the cups either. What's this, Lynn girl? Muffins? Mother sent them. She baked this afternoon. Then we shall have them with our tea, Mrs. Tuggle said, and she turned on the lamp in the parlor. The light fell on the old woman's face, and goosebumps rose on Lynn's arms. It was a strange face, but Lynn didn't know exactly why. That one eye was green and the other gray was of course rather odd, but it was more than that. Both eyes were small and peeked out slyly from dark black brows. Though Mrs. Tuggle's hair itself was gray, she was small and thin, her shoulders sticking up through her dress like doorknobs. But there was something powerful about the bones of her face, as though the jaw itself were made of steel. Lynn decided that, fragile as she looked, Mrs. Tuggle was capable of enormous strength. Sit you down while I put the kettle on, Mrs. Tuggle said. Oh, blueberry muffins! Your mother knows how fond I am of those. She took the platter of muffins and disappeared through the door of the kitchen. When she moved, Lynn noticed. She did it swiftly, unlike most women in their 70s. Quick and strong, the goosebumps spread to her back. I don't know what I'm doing here, Mouse declared as soon as they were alone. If I sit down, you'll probably never see me again. I'll probably evaporate. I told Mother we'd be polite, Lynn said. It won't hurt to stay. A few minutes. She sat down on the green velvet sofa and looked around. The parlor had a high ceiling, and the walls were decorated with a pale violet paper on which thorny stems twisted and turned, entwining in tall vertical lines till they reached the top, where each stem ended in a single rose. A yellowed shade covered a lamp on a stand, and all the furniture was a deep brown mahogany, old and somehow dusty, except for the velvet couch and two chairs. On a small table in one corner stood a few framed photographs, and it was these that caught Lynn's eyes. She got up and went over to look at the large one in the center. It was a photograph of the head and shoulders of a young boy about Stevie's age. He was a pale-looking child with a lock of dark hair that fell partly across his forehead. His eyes, too, looked dark, not only the pupils, but the eye sockets, and he wore a thin chain around his neck with a small medallion in front. On the medallion was a spider design. Lynn was still looking at it when Mrs. Tuggle came back in the room. "Isn't this a picture of your brother, Mrs. Tuggle, the one who drowned?" "That it is, my dear. He was only 6 when that picture was taken. 16 when he died. A short life for a fine young lad." "Did he just fall in, or was he swimming?" "I don't know, child. My husband found him floating face down in the creek, like he just laid himself down in the water. How it happened, we never knew. One day he was here. The next day he was gone. But let's have our tea now, and your mother's muffins." Lynn put the photograph back down and came over to the tray where 3 cups were sitting. Mouse sat gripping the arms of her chair as though she were frozen into position. Mrs. Tuggle noticed. "Here, Marjorie, a little tea will thaw you out," she said, handing Mouse one of the cups. "'Tis my own special brew, and it's never a night. I go to bed without a spot of it first." The light from the lamp cast tall shadows on the walls. As they raised their cups and lowered them again, the dark furniture suddenly seemed even more massive. The brass knobs of the bureau in one corner looked like 2 bright eyes, and the row of scalloped edging along the bottom resembled teeth stretched in a wide straight grin. Mouse sipped hesitantly, but as the hot steam bathed her face, she began to relax a little, and finally leaned back in her chair, her bony knees protruding from under the bottom of the long orange t-shirt. "And what do I hear of the Beasley family?" Mrs. Tuggle inquired directly. "They say that your mother is gone to Ohio, child. Well, that's between parents, and I won't pry, but a girl without a mother to look after her gets lonely, that's sure. Should you ever want for company, come up the hill and sit with an old woman. 'Twould do us both good." Mouse didn't answer, but sat with eyes half closed, holding the cup to her face. "That picture of your brother," Lynn began again, eager to find out more. "What kind of medallion is that around his neck, Mrs. Tuggle?" Did the old woman frown just a bit, she wondered? The one green eye and the one gray one focused intently on Lynn's face. And it was a moment before the old woman answered. "'Tis of no importance, Lynn. We came from Castletown, you know, on the Isle of Man. We ones who are often given charms to wear. The fashion, then, that's all. Sort of to keep the boggles away, you know. Marjorie, dear, hand me that music box on the table. Aye, that's the one. 'Twas his favourite toy, this was." Mrs. Tuggle put down her cup and held the small wood box on her lap. With one skinny hand, she wound the handle at the side, her lips smiling just a little. It was a strange sort of tune, starting out happy enough, but ending on a minor note, and the motion of Mrs. Tuggle's arm made a whirling shadow against the rose stems on the wallpaper. Something brushed against the back of Lynn's neck. She sprang forward, dropping her muffin on the floor, and whirled around. There was the largest cat she had ever seen, slinking along the back of the couch. Mouse turned, but her glasses had steamed up, and when she rubbed her sleeve across them, and the cat came into view, she yelped in fright. "'Tis only Cat," said Mrs. Tuggle. "He likes the music box. Sits on my lap sometimes, he does, when I play it. Soothes his temper, I suppose." It looked almost like a raccoon because its fur was so thick, a deep brown black in color with no spots or stripes at all, and the slits of its eyes flashed yellow in the light of the lamp. "A big thing like that ought to be in a zoo," Mouse declared. "Where did it come from?" "That I can't say," Mrs. Tuggle replied. "Heard a scratching noise at the door one night, I did, and when I opened it, he walked in. He's been with me ever since." "He must belong to somebody," Lynn ventured. "Many a time I've opened the door for him and let him go, but he prowls about the yard a bit and comes back. No, he's a stray, all right, and he's found himself a home. Glad I am to have him, too, for an empty house is a lonely one." She began winding the music box again. The cat, which had sprung to the top of the old bureau, sat purring loudly, and it seemed to Lynn that she could feel the vibration through the arms of her chair. Then Mrs. Tuggle began to sing, and her gold teeth, like the cat's yellow eyes, glistened occasionally. "Sing of morning, sing of noon, sing of evening, silver moon. Feel the darkness touch the black, hear the shadows whisper back." At first, Lynn was interested in watching Mrs. Tuggle, the way her eyes fixed themselves on the music box, the way her thin fingers grasped the handle. Then it was the cat that caught her eye. It crouched there behind the old woman, its tail swishing violently, its eyes looking straight at Lynn, as though reading her thoughts. But suddenly the room seemed far too quiet, and Lynn turned to Mouse to see if she was still there. Marjorie sat on the chair, her empty teacup in her lap, her eyelids drooped. "Mouse," Lynn said, "listen, I think we'd better go." Marjorie did not reply, and Lynn was alarmed that something might have happened to her. She reached over and shook her arm. "Mouse, we've got to go." Suddenly Marjorie's eyes snapped wide open. She looked about, confused. "You said you had all sorts of things to do tonight, Mouse," Lynn urged. "I told Mother we wouldn't be long." Mrs. Tuggle put the music box aside. "Well, another time, then. Come by and see us, Cat and I. And Marjorie, my dear, when you feel you're in need of a mother, come to me, child." She walked to the front door with them. "Truly, it's dark now. Be careful of the loose bricks there in the walk. And thank your mother for me, Lynn." The girls didn't talk till they'd reached the sidewalk in front. "You were hypnotized, Mouse, I swear it," Lynn began. "I wasn't. I knew everything that was going on." "Well, you sure didn't look like it. You were sitting there with your head tipping to one side. I was really worried. Maybe it was the tea." Marjorie was quiet for a moment. "I don't think I should ever go back there, Lynn," she said finally. "I really don't. And yet, I'm sure I will." "Mouse, what's happened to you?" "I don't know. I just can't seem to help myself." Suddenly, from out of the darkness, came the cackling of a flock of crows. It seemed to come from the direction of the barn behind Mrs. Tuggle's house, but the noise of the cawing got louder till it was directly over the girls' heads. Lynn and Marjorie stopped and stared upward. The big black birds could be seen circling around above, and the din of their raucous calling became deafening. Mouse covered her ears and started to run, Lynn following close behind. Down the brick sidewalk they rushed, past the stone walls and hedges and lampposts, till they reached the Morley steps. And the cackling echoed away at last, like laughter against the night sky. And that's the end of chapter 1.